We're going to continue considering modern American poetry. To start out, let's consider what we've been talking about with structure. We can use structure in poetry to find meaning. Because we know about the constraints that poets keep themselves under when they write poems, we can use that knowledge to understand the meaning of their poems better. So if you're reading a poem and you have no idea what's going on in that poem, take a step back and think about the structure of the poem. Here are some things that you can consider. Remember that you can look at the rhyme scheme and think about it like this. You could take 4 lines and say the lines are A, B, B, A, or A, B, A, B. And those that rhyme scheme kind of acts like a tie to sort of tie up those 4 lines together to carry its own meaning. You can even go further and look at the rhyming words themselves, and sometimes those rhyming words will carry rich meaning just in themselves. That doesn't always happen, but you should look. That's always a really neat discovery. You can also look at the stanza divisions. Of course, stanzas work together and create meaning. When I shared with you one of my favorite hymns, Jesus, I Am Resting, Resting, I shared with you stanzas at a time because the stanzas each carried their own set of meanings. You can also look at the organization of the lines in a sonnet. And so we just talked about this before, but just as a quick review, if you find that you have a sonnet and it's an Italian sonnet, a Petrarchan sonnet, you will notice that it is organized in groups of the first 8 lines being an octave and the next 6 lines being a sestet. And here's what you can know, class. You can look at those last 6 lines and you will find a summary of sorts in those last 6 lines that will help you understand the poem better. In the same way, if you have a Shakespearean sonnet, it is organized into groups of 4 lines called quatrains, Q-U-A-R, always means 4, like quarter and court. And so it's no surprise that a quatrain means 4. And there are 3 sets of quatrains in a Shakespearean sonnet or an English sonnet. And then there are 2 lines at the end that are rhymed, and that's called the couplet. And so if you have a Shakespearean sonnet, you can read that couplet, and that couplet provides you with a summary of the poem. If it's written truly as a Shakespearean sonnet and the poet is holding true to form, you will find a summary of the whole poem in those last 2 lines. And then you'll be able to go back into the poem and get better meaning from it. Consequently, if you pause your video here and read this hilarious Shakespearean sonnet, you will find that it is actually very similar in meaning to Millay's poem, in that the speaker of this poem is not very complimentary toward his love, but at the end in this summary says that his love for her is rare because he's loving with this deeper love, not on merit of her looks. So again, you can look at rhyme scheme, you can look at stanzas and organization, but today I want to talk to you about the fact that you can also consider the structure of a typical sentence. You can look at the punctuation. Look for the periods to understand meaning. So for example, let's take our poem that you just read and notice that you shouldn't read it across like this and get to the end of the line and think that you'll find meaning there. You only read to the periods. Find the complete sentences, just like you would in a paragraph. So for example, the first sentence says, "Love is not blind." And that actually is a cliché flipped on its head. So, do you remember when we said in writing an introductory paragraph and having a hook that that is one choice you could make? You could flip a cliche on its head, reword it and rework it to make it kind of sound a little startling. Well, that is exactly what Millay did. She took love is blind, that's the cliche. If somebody you know likes somebody with a lot of flaws, you might say, ah, well, love is blind. She takes that cliche and says instead, love is not blind. And so it acts as a hook to get us into this poem. Anyway, the speaker, I should say, goes on to say this sentence here. And so notice that it starts in the middle of this first line and goes to this line down here. It says, I see with single eye your ugliness and other women's grace. And so the speaker is saying, I see that you're not as pretty as other women. And then look at this one. You have to read 2 lines and then all the way into 2 words into the 3rd line to read this sentence. I know the imperfections of your face, the eyes too wide apart, the brow too high for beauty. And so this speaker goes on to say, I know all of the ways that you're imperfect. Let me list them for you, essentially, is what he's saying. And then the next sentence is actually 4 lines long. It says, learned from earliest youth am I in loveliness, and cannot so erase its letters from my mind that I may trace your faultless. I must love until I die. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. It says, learned from earliest youth am I in loveliness, and cannot so erase its letters from my mind that I may trace you faultless. I must love you until I die. I had to get that beautiful sentence right, because the speaker is saying, I learned early on and cannot erase that learning, that I should consider you faultless and love you until I die. Isn't that a beautiful sentence? And isn't that the way we should look at others? Indeed, that's looking at others from God's perspective. So again, to review, you can consider all of these attributes of structure to help you understand meaning. And so essentially what you're doing is you're chunking the text. You're trying to find groups of sentences, groups of lines that work together to deliver meaning. So you're chunking the text to find meaning. And just very briefly, but most importantly, what is God's perspective of this poem? Well, is it God's perspective that inner beauty is more valuable than outward appearance? I think that we could say that yes, this would be God's perspective. In fact, doesn't he say that man looks on the outside appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart? Now, moving on, that was all the warm-up. So moving on, our learning goal that comes next for the next part of considering modern poetry is that students will identify situational irony in a poem as another means to understand the author's intent. So now that we've decided that you can have the tool in your toolbox of considering structure, we're going to talk about situational irony. But I am almost 9 minutes into this particular lesson, and so we need to stop the lesson here, this video part of it here. And so I'm cutting this lesson apart, and we will start with the learning goal tomorrow. We'll talk more about this. We'll unpack this goal a little bit more. So right now, what I want you to do is go into your text on page 555. You're just going to kind of scan or read very quickly, just skim, not a close reading, the next poem. It's called Cliff Klingenhagen. It's on page 555. And as you read it, I want you to identify the rhyme scheme. You may put your answer in a private comment. Along with that, I want you to identify what type of sonnet it is. Again, if you need to rewind this particular video or the prior videos, you'll see the different characteristics between the Italian sonnet, sometimes called the Petrarchan sonnet, and the Shakespearean or English sonnet. It's one of those two. Identify the rhyme scheme, and then identify the type of sonnet, and look up the word irony as a literature term. So Google search irony literature term and write down a definition from that, because we're going to look at this poem. We're going to do more than this quick scan that I want you to do of it today. We're going to read it and delve deeper into it and find the situational irony evident in this poem. Thank you so much for listening, and this shouldn't be a long lesson for you. You're just, spend like 5 or 6, 10 minutes at the most looking over this poem, because we're really going to pull it apart tomorrow. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful Monday. Goodbye.